God puts us in nations, in places, not by mistake, but to do a job. What if we opened our eyes to the needs of our colleagues, of our leaders, of our subordinates, and we were a priest on their behalf? Welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson.
And I'm Len Johnson.
And we're going to be talking about how to get our business into God's business. Our subtext is Let My Business Go, and we'll have guests from around the world. So thank you for joining us this week and every week on the Repurposing Business Podcast. Well, welcome to the Repurposing Business Podcast. My name is Brett Johnson, and we're in season 5, which is the season when capital meets eternity. And in this week's session, I have the privilege of having Johan and Daryl Heald. And Johan is with SART, which he's going to explain to us what that means. I'm sure you have a few problems trying to get that pronounced correctly in America, Johan. But Johan must have thought about that because he's lived in America, as he'll tell us in a moment. And Daryl Heald, who's across on the other mountain in Chattanooga. And I think there's people who live on Signal Mountain who've never been to Lookout Mountain and vice versa. Yeah, and I'm one of them. So welcome, gentlemen. It's great to have you. This morning, actually, I was just reading in Psalm 49, and one of the things I discovered is that Scripture's way ahead of us on this concept of influencers and followers. And it was quite interesting. In Psalm 49, verse 13, it says that people who've got rich in a self-help, self-made way need to watch out, and their followers who follow them. And I thought, this is kind of the world we live in. You can go onto YouTube, you go on Instagram, social media, and there's a lot of people peddling, how to get financially independent so that you don't have to worry about anything. You can leave a legacy, name a country, a building, anything after yourself. And God says, watch out, because at the end of the day, you're going to end up in a box. And and you guys have really thought a lot about this. And so I'm excited to hear from you on this topic. So Daryl, why don't you start by introducing yourself? I know you've had a path through business and so forth. And I think, Daryl, we met in the late 1990s back in Redwood City when we had an office in Redwood City, California, and you came through and we met back then. And then again, later in Saratoga, we got together again. And then more recently, we've had more of a connection. So tell us a bit about your background.
Right. Thanks, Brett. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on the call with you and with Johan. And as we were talking earlier this morning, just I counted a privilege that y'all are friends, and love South Africa. So always happy to join in this discussion. My background is in commercial real estate. So for the first 10 years in Atlanta, Georgia, I was doing real estate deals. And then, God called me to come work actually with my wife's family, which was back 126 years ago. Her great-great-grandfather founded an insurance company. And from that, now in 5 generations, they created a charitable foundation and family office. And so in 97, I joined there. So it's been over 20 years now working there with that. My real calling, though, and has been not as much on the charitable grant side, but on the generosity side. And it was a personal calling. The God was just having me explore this value proposition that's more blessed to give than receive. And so in 2000, we started Generous Giving. And in 2012, took that work globally with Generosity Path. And that's where Johan and I met. So it's been a real privilege to think about it. I'm intrigued with your topic, with where capitalism meets eternity. So look forward to this discussion today.
Yeah, that's great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Daryl. And thanks for the work that you're doing. I had the privilege of attending one of Daryl's weekends in South Africa in a lovely setting. And it was just a wonderful time to reflect, to contemplate, to connect with others. So I love what you're doing. And you made a comment then when you and I had a conversation that I'll come back to in a little while, which I thought was fascinating. Johan, tell us a bit about yourself.
Hey, thank you. Great to be here with you and Daryl. Yeah, so I have a career of two halves, if you want. The first half I've spent in business as a turnaround CEO. Started in California as a pharmacist with turning around drugstores, and that moved from there to healthcare, insurance in South Africa, and then later on to retail investment platform with Macquarie Bank from Australia. So really had fun doing that. It's a bit of a prophetic thing. You kind of look at a company that's not performing and you see the picture of what it's supposed to look like, and then you just start walking there. And I had a lot of fun doing it. But towards my late 30s, God led me to resign that, and then promptly didn't speak to me again for about a year. So I had a proper desert experience there. And then after that, founded the Tree of Life Foundation and started investment holdings as vehicles through which to manage capital. And I've been busy with that since then.
Fantastic. And I know that what does SART mean, Johan?
So there's a short answer and a long answer. So the short answer is SART is the Afrikaans word for seed. And that is really easy, of course. I normally just stick to that. But the truth is I really came under the impression in that year that I was waiting on God, what it meant to do business post the resurrection of Jesus Christ and the power of that. So it led me to really think about business in an AD rather than a BC way. Okay. I started searching for acronyms, but marketplace AD is mad and business AD is bad. So I settled on South Africa AD, which is so
fantastic. Yeah, that's great. Well, there's many countries and companies that need an AD resurrection. So this is a good thing. Yeah, trust that. Yeah, but this concept of seed is such a big deal when it comes to generosity and to the handling of capital. And Johan, let me start with you. Do you think it's possible to get both a good return for today and a return for eternity? And what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, for sure. I mean, God has designed yield, right? And He is entrusting us to generate yield, and He expects yield, I think, but not yield in the absence of impact. So like everything in life, it's absolutely possible to do both. The world would like to persuade us that we have to choose, but we really don't need to choose between those metrics. They're inherently two sides of the same coin. So, and capital is such a powerful tool through which to effect change. I mean, I'm just listening to Daryl again now in the fifth generation of an insurance business. Was really the starting point of all of that, and it just. It's one of the things that we feel very, very strongly about is that financial services is critical. And let me just say this about financial services. If you look at Acts in the Bible, then the members of a congregation would bring their funds to the apostles and they would distribute it to those in need. Well, if you think about an insurer, it collects premiums from all the families and then make a lump sum payment to the family who lost the breadwinner. So it's really automated acts, as long as you don't have greed in the middle. And that's very powerful. So financial services is definitely, as a side comment, a very powerful tool.
Yeah. Remember I think it was called The Ascent of Money, Niall Ferguson, he talked about how the insurance companies were created by Scottish Presbyterians in terms of their roots, and I see some believers who struggle with this concept of insurance. Well, if I'm trusting God, why do I need insurance? But it's an interesting one. Well, I'm glad that there was insurance because that's led us to Daryl. So that's that's fantastic. Yeah. That's right. And Daryl, I think one of the things you've keyed into is this notion of generosity. You talked about generous giving. And generosity path. I know with generous giving, you kind of had to be up there in terms of your giving levels to even be part of the club. And Well, that was the perception from many people, and you were really encouraging people with means to really connect some meaning to their money, which is fantastic. But I remember you making a comment to me, Daryl, that one of your observations was that the people who were there thought they were poor. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah. It's an interesting phenomenon that it was not an original idea with me. But there's, I think I heard Tim Keller actually first talk about this, is nobody thinks they're rich. Because if you actually do have some means, if we're in the business community, everybody knows that there's a bigger business, right? And if you're reading and keeping up with your industry or anything else like that, I mean, the media is constantly telling us who's who's where on the in the pecking order in terms of net worth, right? And who's the wealthiest man in the world? He actually had a South African, Elon Musk, I think, even this year or last year, I can't remember where the stock prices are. That was top of the world, right? Wealthiest person, and all. But so the interesting thing is where we say, well, whatever I have, I know someone that has a lot more, and so in some ways we never think we're rich. But I think the big idea that I've had to process as well is that because as believers, because who we are in Christ, irregardless of what the how the world measures it, we are rich, right? So if you look at 2 Corinthians 8:9, it's very, very sure, that Paul says, we are rich, but we're rich because of what Jesus has done for us. And so I think, unfortunately, what I would say in the last 20 years and working in this space is that when we say wealth and riches, we only think of it in economic and financial terms. And so I would say there's a greater conversation about about all the other dimensions and aspects.
Correct. Yeah, that's a good point. I remember coming back from Indonesia many years ago, and I stopped in a bookstore in Hong Kong and picked up a book called Spiritual Capital. And it was written by two people, not believers, no religious frame of reference or whatever, but they talked about this concept of spiritual capital. And I know that often with entrepreneurs, as you're dealing with them, that, for them, money's the answer to everything if I had that. But the spiritual capital, if you're doing a kingdom business, relational, political, other, intellectual capital, obviously. But so thinking about capital broadly is a big deal. And understanding, I like your point about, every now and then I say to Lynn as we reflect, look, we are wealthy. We have you travel around the world. I remember going to India, and a friend of ours took us into his home. We went around, we had tea with him and his wife and his two sons, teenage boys at the time. And he proudly showed us his house, tiny kitchen, tiny bedroom. The boys slept in the living room. He and his wife had their own bedroom. And then he showed us his prayer closet. And I don't know if you remember in the South African Army, Johan, you had those metal closets. And he said, this is my prayer closet. And he said, to get quiet when I'm praying, I put my head inside the closet. The guy would kneel down, put his head in this metal cabinet, and he was a real prayer. And I told him, we are rich, no more complaining, none of that stuff. Yeah. And Daryl, I love your stories as you're sharing your stories with Generosity Path. These aren't just the stories of the business owners and so on, but it's the people in villages and such a wonderful reminder. Yeah.
Right.
And tell us a bit how you're changing the mindsets of people, Daryl, where you're getting them to start where they are and have a lifestyle of generosity.
Yeah, well, it's really the Holy Spirit's work in transforming, hearts and minds. But the big idea of what we feel like God just gave us is actually helping people, creating some space where, and I just saw this morning on our WhatsApp group that there's a group right now in Indonesia. You talk about Indonesia going through a journey generosity experience, online, and what we've designed is actually a facilitated experience, exploring this value proposition that it's more blessed to give than receive. So as believers, all of us, know that simple phrase that Jesus said that. But the problem is that we know that, but we don't believe it. Because if we believe it, our decisions, our life would look different. And kind of the long story short on that is that we, instead of it being personal belief, we really operate with a lot of cultural belief. And so there's not a lot of self-awareness, with most of us, that we are, how strong culture is and why we do what we do. Right. Even, like Johan and I met, Johan was gracious enough to spend a few days with me when I first came to South Africa, and started, meeting and having conversations with people about, whether they'd love to, explore this and do some journeys of generosity there. And it was very interesting how I encountered the South African culture, which is the South African culture and then the South African culture of the church, and how they were listening to this idea and whether they wanted to engage it or not. And so it's just interesting kind of where you start and where you actually end. But the Holy Spirit's been doing a lot of significant work in people's hearts.
Wonderful. Yeah. No, it's interesting. I've one of the things is my pet peeves. I don't have too many. Is when people come from another country and they criticize your country. So I would have when we lived in California for about 30 years. Sometimes I'd get my friends from other parts of the world, and they were like Californians, this, Americans, that. But when you look at the history of missions in the last 200 years, about 90% of the giving has come out of the US, and a huge chunk of that has actually come out of California, funnily enough. And I love the generosity of American people. I love the fact that it's built into the tax code, which is great. And it's tapped into a culture of generosity, which I think has just been a wonderful thing. And I think also in part it was when we arrived from South Africa. Johan, this was the trick. When we went to church back in South Africa, your kids, you don't put shoes on your kids when they're young. They got to learn to walk without the shoes and so forth. We would go to church with no shoes on our little kid. I think these people thought, these poor people from Africa, they would bring us TVs and all sorts of leftover junk. Finally, we figured out what it was. Yeah, great. Yeah. So, Johan, you also sit on the boards of different entities and so forth. And one of those is a company we know quite well in the infrastructure building space. And I wrote an article some years ago on 4 categories of givers that I saw. One was planners, people who do the monthly diligent and they plan it out. And then you've got the water walkers, the pilgrims who just kind of throw it all overboard and get out of the boat. And then I think you've got the planters which would tie in with your seed name. And then you've got the platform reformers. And I thought these are the people who tackle systems. And I know you guys have been involved in doing that in not just in the financial world, but also in healthcare and other ways. How does this map to your experience, Johan? What do you see? And that's the first question. My follow-up question will be, if you think about where we give across those different things, the planners, the pilgrims, the planters, and the platform reformers, how do you think we allocate our assets, as it were?
Well, it looks like Daryl gets the easy questions and I get the tough ones. I don't really know, Brett. What I'll say is, it's fascinating to me how God obviously uses a whole continuum of strategies, and that's why I love movement rather than organization, because an organization needs a focus and needs a specific deliverable and needs to know what it needs to get done. But the moment you look up and you see the movement, then you can see God is working across the spectrum. So when you have those 4 categories, and it's actually the first time when I read what you wrote about it, that I came across that. then you realize those are just different places on the continuum, right? You cannot do without any one of those. Obviously, for me personally, I love the platform play because I do think that, whenever you have to take on the system, that is kind of the fun place to be in terms of making a difference. But you cannot say that it's a better place than the rest. I think that your country that you play in plays a role as well. There's obviously countries with a very stable first world system, things work in a certain way. You kind of need to work with wisdom within the system. Whereas in a third world country, I mean, everything is a variable. The exchange rate, political leaders, name it, everything's a variable. So you actually don't have any excuse not to work at a platform level in a third world country, I would think.
Wow, so that's quite something. So it's you don't have any excuse to not be involved at a platform level in a third world country or developing nation. But that's quite challenging, isn't it?
Mm.
I think, but the word of God is quite challenging. I mean, God is quite challenging. The whole phenomenon of temporarily living on Earth, on a short-term outreach to a different planet is very challenging. So we're not working from here towards something. We're actually just visiting this planet. And that concept is challenging. So you're right, it's challenging. But the more we can get our heads around the bigger picture about the perspective, when that perspective is a situation, then it provides context for decision making. So if you work from the perspective towards the problem, you arrive at the right decision. It's when you work from the problem and go find aspects of perspective to apply that you
right.
So, Daryl, did you have any thoughts you wanted to add to that?
Well,
Johan thought it was a hard question.
Yeah, he did a good job answering that. I'm glad he got that one too. But I would say, just to go back to what we were originally talking about, the issue of, no one thinks they're rich. That's a perspective issue. And so if I already told you, hey, Brett, be very obvious, right? If I say, hey, Brett, guess what? That investment you and I made, I'm giving you a dividend check for $10 million. Then you're like, okay, well, maybe I'm rich now, right? But it's kind of what we were talking about before. We kind of lost that whole thing. But if we know, because of what Jesus has said, that we are rich in him in all these different aspects, then this whole sense around why are we doing what we're doing and the way that we're doing it? And most of us, if we're, in pursuit of business, we would say, to, create wealth, to get rich, in a lot of ways is frankly how most people would answer that. But if we already know we're that, then then I think, again, our life would look different. There would be more of a spirit of contentment, right? Yeah. Less about chasing, less about, accumulating, and more about if I already know that I am in light of eternity, then how I see things, that whole perspective we're talking about is going to be completely different. And that's why Jesus said to us, to the disciples and to us in Scripture, he who has eyes to see and ears to hear. Yeah. And this is what we're really called to do. And we only do it through Scripture and the help of the Holy Spirit to give us these spiritual eyes and spiritual ears.
Yeah. It's a great point. I remember reading a book by Sunday Adelaja. I don't know if you know him. He's a Nigerian pastor who has a big church in the Ukraine. And when his church had grown to about 15,000, this is now pretty much a mega church in Kiev. When I was in Kiev in 1992, there was hardly anything there. And wow. So he's got this church, 15,000 at the time. And God said to him, "You're worse than the unprofitable servant." He said, "I'm a pastor of 15,000 people." He said, "Yeah, but you live, whatever comes in every month goes out every month. And at least the unprofitable servant preserved capital. You don't even preserve capital." And he began he began to think about this, quite a challenge. And so then changed his mindset and began to teach his people how to grow wealth, how, starting with little things, buying an apartment. Instead of buying yourself a big house, buy something you can rent out, stay in a small place. One woman in his church started selling plastic bags in the subways in Kiev and built up from there. And when I checked about 10, 12 years ago, I think he'd helped about, I don't know, like maybe 100 people become millionaires in US dollar terms in Kiev. And, and he had political influence as well. When there was a big political issue, and he got his whole congregation, by that stage about 25,000, to just go outside the government buildings and worship. And they just worshiped in the streets. And so, yeah, he was challenged by this thing. And so the book title, Money Won't Make You Rich. And I love your point, Daryl. Already rich. Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. So context is important. I know when I look at leaders, my observation on leaders is that, you can see leaders when they become mature leaders, they want to tackle giants. They want to reform platforms. They want to change systems. And so Bill Gates, as a young leader, you want to outsmart IBM or do better than Steve Jobs or something. But later on, you want to deal with global issues. Same thing, you'll see it with the Richard Bransons and with the Mandelas and others. And so, Johan, you're saying that this is that fighting giants is the domain of a mature leader. So if, once you've gone beyond turning around companies and doing that kind of stuff, you tackle the systems issues. Is that right?
I don't know if it's linearly progressive like that. I don't think everybody is called to do that. You always have more pioneering people that find their comfort in a place of nothingness, to go stand in a place of nothingness with a picture in their mind's eye and being prepared to stand there until the picture becomes visible. And then you have people who are excellent at converting on that picture and optimizing it. So I think by nature we have different DNA and we have different skill sets that come into play. I mean, over the years I've seen in my life that I need to get it out of the way of the others pretty quickly after, you've pioneered, because your incompetence then becomes blatantly obvious. We're in the pioneering phase, you need that blind faith, where you just go and say, well, I've seen the picture, I believe the picture, I'm going to stand here until it comes to fruition. And that's great. I mean, some of my friends always say, but you arrange a party and you go through all the trouble, get all the people, line up the itinerary, and then as a first guest show up, you go out for the exit and you're off somewhere else. You never stay for the party. And, so I do think some of that is because of pioneering and not necessarily that you go from one phase to another, but you just have different topics of pioneering over time.
Okay, yeah. Now, speaking of pioneering, Johan, one of the things that you've done is you've bridged the world of for-profit and non-profit and trying to get NGOs, non-profit organizations, and so on to think differently about sustainability when it comes to finances, capital, and so forth. What have you done there?
So our attack has been from the capital side, right? So, I mean, there's probably about three things that we feel fairly strongly about in the capital space. The one we've touched on, and that is that collective capital is a good idea, because if you bring capital together, then you can do bigger things. The second that ties closely with it is the question of the agenda of capital. I think back in 2016 at the Christian Economic Forum, we used the phrase, capital always has an agenda. And I think, that is a very profound thing for me, is that whether by design or by default, your capital has an agenda, and you're supposed to decide what it is. And people with the same agenda will bring their capital together. So if your agenda is to have a 20% IRR and liquidity in 5 to 7 years, it's easy to find people with the same agenda, and then you'll join the same private equity fund who promises that, and it's very powerful. You can do massive investments because you bundle together with people of the same agenda. But if you say that the agenda of our capital is Christ, then you introduce a level of complexity there, but a wonderful a wonderful problem to have. So that's the second thing that we feel strongly about, because then, as Daryl has said, it becomes very simplistic to some extent. Does God really want this industry to grow? Does he want his capital here? Would he be thrilled if this company or not? And then the third thing that, I'm a citizen of South Africa, a permanent resident of the US, so I kind of have a foot in both countries. But I feel very strongly that if you want to make a difference in a country like South Africa, you need to work with local people who can act as overseers. I think over the years, people have been very disappointed with their donated funds. Not all, some have had huge success, but oftentimes when they have been disappointed, it's because they didn't understand the culture, as Daryl referred to, they didn't partner with overseers. You can partner with local ministries, that's one thing, but you also need to partner with local overseers. So we believe that, in this space of this capital with an agenda, you need to focus on a place. Be focusing on South Africa and acting as stewards in that way here locally. So it's been a journey to change the mindset of, deciding on the agenda of your capital, being willing to partner with like-minded in a collective vehicle, and stewarding, taking the position of a steward rather than an owner.
Yeah, those are three wonderful parts. Did you want to add to that, Daryl?
Yeah, well, I love that whole phrase of, capital does have an agenda. The way that I've said is that money is not neutral.
Yeah,
right. If we think money is neutral, then we're in trouble. And but so because money will only it will only entice you, right, to if it's the love of money, right, as we know, is the root of all evil, and will entice you to do more and more and more, right? So it's insatiable. There's no contentment in that. And the only way to break the power of money is to give it.
Yeah, that's a wonderful. So we got three great thoughts over there. Yeah, I remember when I was writing the book, Repurposing Capital, and it was pushed by the advance of Islamic finance. And and Christians, I was asking a mutual friend of Johan, well, all of ours, about what the biggest problem in Africa, and the response was the Muslims are buying up the place, and there was a bit of an objection as Christians that the Muslims were using capital to advance their agenda. Well, this is what happens. It doesn't matter whether it's the British Empire or the Muslims or the French or Christians. I mean, we do have an agenda with our capital, but the Muslims have been smarter about discipling people with the leverage of capital and discipling nations with the leverage of capital than we have. And so I love that. I love that we own that. That capital always does have an agenda, yeah. And so that's true. Yeah. And then to your point, Daryl, about just the understanding of that, and how generosity breaks the grip of capital is a big deal. So let's unpack that a little bit. What would be some of your best examples of that, Daryl?
Well, I think that this whole idea of I'm just blanking on his first name, but a lot of us are familiar with the name William Wilberforce.
Sure.
Right. So I think it was John Thornton was one of his good friends and a very successful businessman. And they were part of this group called the Clapham sect. I remember reading in one of the biographies of Wilberforce, just recalling of Thornton. So here's a business guy, because William Wilberforce was a politician and the reformer, right? He was the what do you call, I guess, in your vernacular, Brett, water walker, and also was really going after the systems, right? And the on slavery and manners and things like that. And Thornton was a businessman, as his friend, and his whole deal was, he was an investor as much as he was in business. He also was an investor in supporting the kingdom. And this was the one story that I remember. I was just like, wow, this is a really kingdom investor. And the story goes like this, that he was sitting at his desk and he was opening the mail. And as he read this letter, according to his secretary, something like that, or maybe he was having it read to him, is that several of his ships. So he was, had a big shipping business going back and forth from the UK to the US, or several of them went down. And in his response, instead of like, oh my gosh, I just lost a lot of money here, this was his response. He says, he asked the secretary, please get me my checkbook. He says, while we still have the time and I have money to give, this is the best thing to do. So in that whole point of like kind of devastating loss. I mean, these are some significant losses, right? If several of these ships go down, his whole thing, while we still have the time. Yeah. His instinct was to give it. Yeah. And that to me, it was like, wow, okay. That's the example. That's the picture of me of where, he's thinking with an eternal mindset.
Wonderful. Yeah. That's wonderful, Daryl. Daryl, at the other end of the spectrum, the chicken lady.
Yes.
Tell us about the chicken lady.
Yeah, or I have another really interesting example of that was also current, and I'll go to her as well. But so we had also developed the Journey of Generosity for oral learning cultures, and a remarkable story came out of just kind of in these, the kind of the wastelands between Somalia and Ethiopia, right? There's not a lot of good things happening there. And unfortunately, in this one case, a woman was kidnapped and was being held for ransom. And the ransom was $15. Okay. So, but to this village and to this church, in this community, she was part of that. $15 to these people, right, is a lot of money, and they didn't have it. But of course, they're totally distressed about this, about her being kidnapped, and so they were thinking and praying about this. One of them realized that one of their friends had knew someone that had been through a journey of generosity, and for some reason says, "Hey, do you think maybe that could help us? There's someone that knows about this." And so, long story short, they went through this whole experience, and they don't. I mean, there wasn't like any particular thing that happened other than the fact that just over the next week or so, they literally collected the $15 and had given it to the pastor. He was going to go buy her, freedom from, while he was getting ready to do that, she walks back into the village. And so everyone, there's this great rejoicing and things like that. And so the pastor says, as everyone's gathered there, he said he was prepared to give all the money back. And they said, no, we've already given it. Now we know, the joy of this. Right. And so it's interesting how God works on that. So you asked particularly about this one story that we show in Uganda. And one of my friends had introduced me to a remarkable man there in western part of Uganda named Bishop Hannington. And he told me the story about this lady in his village that was, severely handicapped, couldn't walk, and literally just went around the village, on her, just scooting herself with her hands. And you can imagine going around an African village, like that for the majority of her life. And one of my friends had actually taken Bishop Hannington through this program where he understood then what God was calling him to is that I know the rest of the world, we even think that we're poor, and the rest of the world thinks that we're really poor. But as believers, again, as we talked about before, we're rich. So let's start being generous. And it was really remarkable how it just changed the whole village, to the point at which this lady had been in the village for decades.
Yeah.
And all, but their response is they saw her differently. Remember, we talked about perspective and eyes to see. We see her differently. And one of the crazy things is her response, even as they were building a new church, was to give. She had one chicken, and she gave that chicken. And they were like, no, you shouldn't do that. That's your one chicken. She goes, no, wait a minute. If everyone else is giving, I get to give as well, right? Which is this whole idea about where we talked about the Macedonian church in their extreme poverty and undue hardship, welled up rich generosity, right? It says that, Paul says that they actually begged him for the opportunity to give to the Jews there in Jerusalem who were hurting, even though they were in the same circumstance. So she totally understood this message, and she's like, I'm not going to, I know that you look at me, maybe even in this poor village, as maybe the bottom here, but I'm telling you what, I'm giving my chicken. Well, that just like rocked everyone's world in the village. And then all of a sudden they're just like, wow. So what did they do? They ended up, the village ended up building her a new house, new hut. They bought a wheelchair for her. And then the kids take turns pushing her all around the village now. And then they put together a collective, like chicken co-op, and she's the head of it. So they call her the queen of the chickens now. So she's like in charge of 300 chickens and so on. And it's just one of these amazing stories where we see, as we talk about, this is just grace upon grace upon grace, and all that. So lots of fun.
Wonderful. Okay, Johan, you're waiting for the tough questions, right? So you talked a bit about stewardship, and I know that one of our responsibilities is to find good soil, because there's endless need in terms of people need this, need that. But as an investor, you have to find good soil. And if somebody says, all right, I want to put my money into a place where it gets an eternal return, and of course, I have to live, I have to feed my family, I have to be content, I have to do these kind of things. But how do you determine good soil?
Yeah, look, I think, again, everything has context, right, Brett? And I mean, the place where we play, or where we like to play, just to provide that context, is with the nation capital. So we don't really hold ourselves out as the managers of private capital. We have a little bit of that we do. I won't say reluctantly, but we do that to some extent. Our sweet spot is to manage donation capital, so that in that context, people already have decided to give it away. And now there's one metric out of the way almost. It's not has to go back. But even in the context of that, you always have, from a seed perspective, what are you going to sow? What are you going to store? And what are you going to give the workers to eat? So that in any business comes into play. Yeah, and there, without over spiritualizing it, that there is where you need to rely on the wisdom from the Holy Spirit, because if you stored pre-COVID, in a certain business, it may have been the right thing to do. If you sowed more than you would normally sow because you were in a last mile logistics business before COVID, then you did the right thing. So we like rules, because rules ultimately put us back in control. But there are no rules. It's a relationship game, right? So I'm going to come back to your question, but I just want to make this comment because we talked about other faiths and how effective that is. And it's sad for me that faiths that operate on a rules basis as to how much should you give, when should you give, actually fare better often than us that work on a relationship basis that says, I've got a relationship with you. I would love to talk to you about your money. And I have an opinion, says God, about how you should spend it. So that becomes way more tricky. And we always aspire for rules because that puts us back in control. Now, on your soil, and I'll be brief, I believe God says you must worship me in spirit and in truth. So the truths are the truths, and he created the truths. What you reap, you will sow. So you follow the truths. What are the truths? The truth is you don't jump off of a cliff and expect not to get hurt. You check the cash flows in the business. You look for a good entrepreneur that has good business acumen. That is a good soil, and there are truths that you can identify and that you can adhere to. And then you only override those truths when the Spirit tells you explicitly to do so. And that has happened not often in my life, but it has happened. And those were joyous occasions where you say, well, God really tells you not to look at the cash flow here. Just put your money in there and go for it. And that's great. But my experience is that it happens, but it doesn't happen every day. And for the rest, God wants you to understand the truths because he created with those truths built in, hard-coded into the nation.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things that is, I should have understood better as a chartered accountant. I'm a reformed chartered accountant, which means I can't balance a checkbook. But the difference between capital and working capital, you alluded to the 2 Corinthians 9, he who gives seed for sowing and seed for bread. And sounds like built into your organization and into your model is distinguishing what is seed for sowing, which is capital, and what is seed for bread, which is more like working capital. And failure to distinguish capital from working capital, I think, is a big failing on the part of us as believers. And I know that there's more to that story, but it sounds like part of what you've done, from what I understand, is if donated capital comes in and it's 100 rands or 1,000 rands or 1,000,000 rands, you distinguish between which goes to meeting the electric bills, the salaries, and so on, and which gets planted for future harvests. Is that correct?
I think you're absolutely right. I like a strategic approach. So in other words, we as Christians have been very effective tactically. We have a soup kitchen this weekend, or we have a men's retreat this weekend. And I think we're on par in terms of tactics. Where we are not on par, in my humble opinion, is strategy. So, in a company, you need the sales guys who are tactical. They'll get the guy to sign the order. But you also need the marketing guys to create the environment. And I think when we think about capital, we've been great on the tactical spending of capital to get a bang for our buck. And we've been fairly under the benchmark in terms of the strategic. What does that imply? It implies that we have to develop an endowment type of thinking, sustainability of capital, where you say, what happens if I have the compounding effect of reinvesting this without withholding giving, but balancing giving with investing? And if you look at the great institutions in the US with big endowment funds, what a blessing they have been and will continue to be for a very long time. And they can tackle strategic projects because it doesn't need to give a return this year, because I'm going to spend from my endowment. So I think we need to be strategically wise in building an endowment mentality amongst Christians and giving sustainably and strategically from that.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. Yeah. Yeah. I remember years ago meeting with a guy who was a wealth manager, an asset manager for Bank of America in California. And he said, Brett, I'm very excited. I'm reading all these books about God and business, but I don't get the connection to my job. I said, find your job in the Bible, and the screensaver went on, you could see the goldfish going by. So I said to him, what do you do? He said, I'm an asset manager. I said, what does an asset manager do? Well, a client brings me 5 million and then I got to turn it into 7 million. And I said, God's an asset manager. And I, just unpacked, the many parables that Jesus told, the stories told. I'm going to give you so much. I'm going away. When I come back, or whether it's a vineyard or a talent or whatever. And I said to him, you and God are in the same business. And the guy lit up, and then I said to him, now, if you can teach your $5 million San Francisco client to get a return for today, but also get a return for eternity, then you and God, what are you doing on a daily basis? You and God are in the same business. And so I love that's built into your business model, Johan. And Daryl, I love the fact of dealing with this issue of greed, which is a problem. When we started taking teams into nations, we realized we'd been repurposing businesses, but there was still this concept of greed, fear, sitting with the lives of believers who were running businesses, and how generosity is a way to break that. And I really love that. When you told the Thornton story, Daryl, I thought you were going to tell the one about when Wilberforce came back and said, we've abolished slavery. And Thornton's response was, what shall we abolish next?
Yeah, I love that. I hadn't heard that one. I love that.
Which is wonderful. Yeah.
He was all ready, right? I mean, he just primed, ready. Yeah. What do you need? What do you need? Right.
Yeah. So I love that. And I think if we can, through this generosity, the work you guys are doing, the encouragement, I love your thing, Daryl, check the box. You're already rich, right? You have capital. Now, what are you going to do? And it's a both and, as Johan was saying, it's tomorrow and it's today and eternity. I love that. And I love your practical tips, Johan. Sometimes God will override your intellect and your calculation. But this is also not rules-based. I love that because we have to get back to, I really wrestled with this when I wrote the book Repurposing Capital, because if you're going to go to a central bank and say, this is how you do biblical finance, it's like based on whose rules? And you have to go back to the heart of God and the ways of God, I find. So, and the heart of God is that there be a culture of generosity, and, as well as stewardship. It's all his. So I love that. So Daryl, Johan, thank you so much for taking the time. Are there any closing thoughts? And let me get from each of you, what is God speaking to you about at this point in regard to capital, wealth, money, finance, or anything in general?
Yeah, I would. Well, Brad, thanks for the opportunity to be here with both of y'all. I'm always challenged by your intellect and your mind. Good questions today. I always love hearing Johan's thoughts. We serve on some boards together, so I enjoy that. I would say, the real practical side of what I would say, I was sharing with a group last week. I learned from one of my mentors about 15 years ago, is that every day God gives us opportunities. Do we have eyes to see and ears to hear? Right. And so this whole idea about because, in our own head and heart, generosity is really hard to do. And he said, this becomes a discipline. And this is where, he just told me story, I'd take guys to his ranch there in Texas, and he'd tell stories for 24 hours of what this looked like in his life, because he didn't learn it, he said, till he was 60. And so just this whole idea is that literally we plan our day, but God orchestrates it. And so when we actually see people, hear an opportunity, or we see someone, then that's the opportunity, right? And so asking God, then right then, spontaneously, what do I need to do? And with the courage and faith to go ahead and do that. And that's what I would say is where that's been one of the most significant things for me in my own life, is develop this discipline of generosity. And so sometimes, again, it's not always just a financial gift. It could just be a smile. It could be a text to someone, a text of encouragement as God brings someone to mind, opening a door. It's just courtesy, things like that, showing dignity and respect to people. That's just part of generosity every day.
Lovely.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, likewise, Red. It's been so great to be here. Certainly enjoyed it, and So Daryl didn't tell you that when he visited South Africa to bring Generosity Path there, I actually, one of my first reactions was that it would never work in South Africa. So in not mentioning that. But we are so donor fatigue in South Africa. My doorbell rings 7 times a day, and it's someone that needs something, right? Sometimes it's a jersey, sometimes it's a sandwich, and you have to discern all the time. So that was my comment. And I'll never forget Daryl's response. He just quietly looked into the distance and said, "That's interesting. It would be the first place in the world where it doesn't work." So, and lo and behold, it worked tremendously well. So that's been great. I think what excites me is, looking at South Africa is the movement principle rather than the organization principle. We're busy with our little playing in capital, and I look to the left and I see Trigger Ventures, who's like the Praxis of South Africa, having an incubator, redemptive purpose of business. I look to my right and I see Halftime Institute helping people to move from success to significance, and I can go on and on and on. And as those things are falling in place, we're such a small little country, only 60 million people. We can really be an incredible case study. You could put your arms around this, and in a question of 50 or 60 years, you could see incredible results. So that's what excites me, and I believe we're seeing some of those signs on the horizon. Watch this space.
Wonderful. Well, we're still trusting God for that revival to break out from Cape Town. Half of the miracle will be, 10% of the miracle will be the revival. 90% will be getting Cape Townians to leave Cape Town, which is
it's a beautiful spot. It's a special place in the world, that's for sure.
Certainly is. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. It's been wonderful to be with you, and thank you for this perspective. I'm sure it's going to be a blessing to many people.